The man who married at 60, the room was quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet, the heavy kind. The kind that sits in a room for years and never leaves. A 60-year-old man sat at a small wooden table. In front of him was a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. He didn't notice. His eyes were fixed on a single envelope. It had arrived that morning. No return address. Just his name written slowly in blue ink. He had stared at it for almost 10 minutes before opening it, because deep down, he already knew something about this letter was different. Something about it felt like the past knocking on a door he had tried to lock forever. Finally, he opened it. Inside was a small piece of paper. Only one sentence was written on it, 7 words. Do you remember the promise you made? The man froze. His fingers trembled slightly as he read it again. Do you remember the promise you made? Most people would not understand why those words mattered. But for him, they carried the weight of nearly 40 years. Because only one person in the world could have written that sentence. And that person had disappeared 38 years ago. He slowly leaned back in his chair. His heart was beating faster now, not from fear, from memory, the kind of memory that waits quietly for decades and then returns all at once. But before we continue, let me ask you something. Have you ever had a moment when the past suddenly returned? A smell, a song, a letter, something small that opened a door you thought was closed forever. If that has ever happened to you, right? I understand in the comments, because what happened to this man next would change the rest of his life. The strange thing is that this man never expected to marry, at least not anymore. But it was not because he didn't want love. In fact, he had wanted it more than most people. He simply believed that life had already made the decision for him. His mornings always looked the same. He woke up at 5:30, the same alarm clock he had used for almost 20 years rang every morning. He would sit up slowly, stretch his back, walk quietly to the kitchen, make coffee, 2 eggs, toast. Then he would sit by the window while the sun slowly climbed into the sky. Outside, the world was always moving. Cars passed. People walked their dogs. Neighbors rushed to work. Life was happening everywhere, but inside his house, things stayed still. The walls had very few pictures, no wedding photographs, no children's drawings, no family vacations, just one old photograph on a small shelf, a photo taken almost 40 years ago. A photo of a younger man standing beside a young woman. They were both smiling, but if you looked closely, you could see something else in that photo. Hope. The kind of hope only young people carry, the belief that the future will unfold exactly the way they imagine it. But life rarely follows the plans we make when we are 20. Sometimes a single moment changes everything. And for this man, that moment happened when he was 22. But we will come back to that, because first, something strange is about to happen. He picked up the letter again. He read the sentence one more time. Do you remember the promise you made? The question echoed in his mind. Of course, he remembered. He had remembered every single day for 38 years. The problem was not remembering. The problem was what the promise meant, because the promise he made was simple, but keeping it had become impossible. He stood up slowly, walked toward the small shelf, and picked up the old photograph. His fingers touched the edge of the picture carefully, almost gently, as if the pieces could break if he held it too tightly. The young woman in the photo had bright eyes, not the loud kind, the calm kind, the kind that made you feel like the world was not rushing anywhere. He had met her on a quiet summer afternoon. Near a bookstore, he had gone there looking for a used novel. She had been standing near the door, trying to decide between two books. Neither of them knew that moment would change their lives. He remembered how she had laughed when he made a terrible joke. He remembered how they ended up talking for almost 2 hours. And he remembered the last thing she said to him before they separated that evening. She had looked at him and smiled. Then she said something simple, "Promise me something." He had laughed. "What kind of promise?" She paused for a moment before answering. "If life ever pulls us apart, promise you will find me again." He didn't think about the question very long, because when you are 22, you believe the future is wide open. You believe distance is temporary. You believe love is stronger than time. So he said yes. He promised. But 2 weeks later, she disappeared. No goodbye, no explanation, no letter. Just silence. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. He searched for her everywhere he could. He asked friends, neighbors, anyone who might know where she went. No one had answers. Eventually, people told him something he did not want to hear. Maybe she just moved on. But deep down, he knew that was not the whole story. Something about the way she left never made sense. Still, life kept moving. Years passed. He focused on work, on routine, on quiet days and long evenings. Slowly, the search stopped. But the memory never left, and neither did the promise. That is why the letter shook him so deeply. Because if someone was asking about that promise, it meant the past was not finished yet. He placed the photograph back on the shelf. Then he looked at the letter again. There was no address, no signature, just the question. But something inside him began to change. For decades he had believed that chapter of his life was over. Now he was not so sure. He walked to the door, opened it, and looked at the quiet street outside. For a moment he hesitated, because stepping outside meant something important. It meant choosing to reopen a story that had been closed for almost 40 years. Most people would have stayed inside. Most people would have thrown the letter away. But something about that question would not leave his mind. "Do you remember the promise you made?" Yes, he remembered. And suddenly he realized something else. A promise is not something that disappears just because time passes. A promise waits quietly, patiently, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, and sometimes until the exact moment when it must finally be answered. So he did something he had not done in a very long time. He packed a small bag, just a few clothes, a notebook, the photograph, and the letter. Then he locked the door to his house. He stood there for a moment, looking at the place where he had spent so many quiet years. He did not know when he would come back, or if he would come back at all, but he knew one thing: he could not ignore the letter. Not after all these years. He stepped onto the sidewalk and began walking toward the bus station. He did not have a full plan, only one destination in mind: the small town where he had met her all those years ago, the place where the promise began. But what he did not know yet was that the truth waiting for him there would be far more complicated than he imagined, because the woman he was searching for had not simply disappeared. She had left for a reason that would take him nearly 40 years to understand. And when he finally discovered the truth, it would change everything he believed about the past. But before we continue, I want to ask you something. If someone you love disappeared for nearly 40 years, would you still try to find them? Or would you leave the past behind? Right, find them, or let it go in the comments, because the decision this man just made will lead him toward the most unexpected moment of his life. The moment when a man who thought his story was already finished would finally discover that love sometimes arrives when people least expect it, even at 60, and the most surprising part of all is who was waiting for him when he arrived